Good morning, everyone. The message this morning is from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. And it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggles against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood." So in these verses, the writer of Hebrews likens the Christian life to a race. And it's a race that we must run with endurance as we keep our eyes focused on Jesus. And that race begins when we commit our lives to Jesus, and it ultimately ends in heaven for eternity. But how do we negotiate the course in between? And we notice in Hebrews 12 that it begins with the word therefore. And therefore refers back to things in chapters 10 and 11. So in chapter 10, groups of Christians who have been persecuted are being addressed. And they've lost homes and property, and in some cases they've been physically hurt. But they're being encouraged to keep going, to hang on to their faith. Then in Hebrews 11, these Christians are encouraged by stories of men and women of faith who have lived lives pleasing to God. These men and women of faith are included in the great cloud of witnesses that's referred to in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. But these men and women of faith in chapter 11 were not perfect people. For example, Noah is mentioned in chapter 11, and according to Genesis 6, verse 8, he was the only man who found grace in the eyes of the Lord during his time. But he's also described in Genesis 9, verses 20 to 27, as being drunk. So Noah was not perfect. Rahab's also mentioned in Hebrews 11 as a woman of faith, but we know that Rahab was a prostitute. David was an adulterer and a murderer, and Gideon was distraught with fear. So none of these men and women were perfect, but they all ran the race, and they all ran it victoriously as they continued to progress more and more towards Christ-likeness. And this is encouragement to us because we also are not perfect, but we're called to run our race and progress more and more towards Christ-likeness. So how do we run this race? Well, if we look back to our Bible verses, Hebrews 12, verse 1, says, "Let us throw off everything that hinders." And some translations say, let us lay aside every encumbrance. And in Greek, the word for encumbrance is onkos, and it means a weight, a burden, a mass, or a load. And like those who've gone before us, we're not perfect. We carry a lot of weight that hinders our spiritual progress. We may carry the weight of sin, and that's things we do that we know are wrong, but we're not willing to let go of them. Things like bitterness, envy, addictions, anger, unforgiveness, fear. All of these things hinder our spiritual progress. Or it might be that we're carrying the weight of distractions, things that aren't necessarily sinful, but they hold us back and slow our spiritual progress. And this could be things like watching too much television or too much time on social media, too much time surfing the net or playing video games. And for me, and perhaps for many of us, excessive watching and listening to coronavirus news early in the piece was anxiety-provoking, and that sort of fear is a hindrance to our spiritual walk. There's a story on YouTube of the Franklin expedition, which occurred in 1845, and it's worth watching. And it's quite a long YouTube video, but it illustrates the consequences of carrying excess weight. So the shortened version goes like this. It says, in 1845, the ill-fated Franklin expedition sailed from England to find a passage across the Arctic Ocean. The crew loaded their 2 sailing ships with a lot of things they didn't need. These things included a 1,200-volume library, fine china, crystal goblets, and sterling silverware for each officer with his initials engraved on the handles. Amazingly, each ship took only a 12-day supply of coal for their auxiliary steam engines. But the ships then became trapped in frozen plains of ice, and after several months, Lord Franklin died. The men decided to trek to safety in small groups, but none of them survived. And there's one story that's particularly heartbreaking. 2 officers pulled a large sled more than 85 miles across the treacherous ice. When rescuers found their bodies, they discovered that the sled was filled with table silver. So these men had contributed to their own deaths by carrying what they didn't need. And sometimes we do the same. We carry excess baggage that we don't need, and it hinders us. And our excess baggage could be bad habits or grudges or anger. But Hebrews 11, verse 1, at least 12, verse 1, tells us to lay aside every weight. The next part of verse 1 says run with perseverance, or some translations say run with endurance. And this phrase suggests that the Christian life race is not a quick sprint. Rather, it's more like a marathon. And to run with endurance means that when we face difficulties and trials and attempted to veer off course, we instead must continue to trust God and to obey Him and to serve Him. And our endurance in the race is really an expression of our faith in God. I've just got a short YouTube video now, and it's a story of a marathon runner called John Akwari from Tanzania.
At the 1968 Mexico City Marathon, 3 men earned the right to stand on the victory platform, the winners of the gold, silver, and bronze Olympic medals. But for some, the reward is a personal one, the knowledge that they finished what they set out to do. A little over an hour after the winner of the marathon crossed the finish line, John Stephen Akwari of Tanzania approaches the stadium, the last man to complete the journey. A voice calls from within to go on, and so he goes on. Afterwards, it was written, "Today we have seen a young African runner who symbolizes the finest in the human spirit, a performance that gives true dignity to sport, a performance that lifts sport out of the category of grown men playing at games, a performance that gives meaning to the word courage." Perhaps the words of John Stephen Akwari epitomize all that is right in the human spirit. When asked why he did not quit, he said simply, "My country did not send me 5,000 miles to start the race. They sent me 5,000 miles to finish the race." The light in this Tanzanian runner is a beacon to us all.
So you can see in this video that at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, John Akwari finished last by a very, very long way. In fact, no place finisher in a marathon had ever finished quite so last as John did. And along the route he was injured, and he finally stumbled into the stadium with his leg bleeding and bandaged and with a very damaged knee, more than an hour after everyone else had arrived. And by the time he got there, there weren't too many people left in the stadium. But when he was asked why he continued to run despite his injury, he said, as we saw in the video, "My country did not send me here to start the race. They sent me here to finish." And the writer of Hebrews suggests that that should be our attitude as Christians. There's a race marked out for us, and we must keep running with endurance until we reach the finish line. And the finish line of our race is Christ-likeness. And as we run the race, we grow and we mature and become more like Jesus. And ultimately, our finish line is in heaven for eternity. Verse 1 also tells us that the race has been marked out for us. Each of us must run the race that God has set before us. So in one sense, we're all running the same race as we commit to being faithful in our call to follow Jesus. But in another sense, we each have a particular race which God has set before us, a race that is unique to us as individuals with our own set of circumstances, our own abilities and gifts. And God calls us to run the race that he has designed specifically for us. Hebrews 12 verse 2 tells us to run with our eyes on Jesus. And there's a story of an old seaman who said, during the fiercest storms, the only way a ship can survive is to keep its nose pointed straight into the wind. And if you try to turn to the left or the right, the ship may capsize. And that's good advice for us as well. As we run the race of our Christian lives, we must run with our heads up and our eyes focused on Jesus. We must run straight towards him and not be distracted from our path. In Hebrews 12, verses 3 and 4, the writer is concerned that those he's writing to may grow weary as they run the race set before them. And in growing weary, they may become discouraged and lose heart. And the people who first read the letter to the Hebrews were believers who'd come out of the Jewish religion and believed that Jesus was the Messiah. But they were being severely persecuted for their beliefs, and in their weariness, they were in danger of returning to the Jewish religion and giving up their new faith in Christ. And the writer of Hebrews is encouraging them to keep moving forward and to consider Jesus and the hostility that he endured. And the word consider in Greek means to consider by weighing or comparing. So here the writer's actually saying to these persecuted believers that they need to look at what Jesus went through as he faced so much hostility, and then consider their own circumstances and recognise that they also will have to endure much as they run the course God set for them. So how do these verses apply to us today? Well, today our endurance isn't so much measured by our ability to overcome persecution. For us, the opposition from sinners comes from the attitudes, ideas and attractions of the sinful world that we live in. And like the Hebrews, we're also in danger of becoming weary and faint-hearted because the world has such a strong hold on our Christian minds and lifestyles. We live in a broken world, and the writer of Hebrews is saying we must be careful not to underestimate the endurance that's required to be transformed into the image of Christ rather than conform to this world. I was thinking about endurance in terms of when I've had to work really hard to stay focused on Jesus and not veer off course. As Christians, we're often able to choose who we mix with, and we generally choose to hang around people who have similar attitudes and values to ourselves. But we can't always make that choice. For example, in a work situation. And I worked for a couple of years in a very toxic environment where there was strife like I'd never come across before. And to maintain an attitude of love and forgiveness in that environment and not be drawn into the bitterness and anger was really difficult. And I often failed. And it was exhausting, really exhausting. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, that's a simple story, but I think the writer of Hebrews is saying to us, don't underestimate the endurance that's required as we run the course that God has set for us. I'm just going to finish with a story about Corrie ten Boom. And as we know, Corrie spent some years in Nazi concentration camps where hope was lost for most people. But she survived to tell her story of faith and hope in God. She saw the face of evil. She saw the most inhumane things that man can do to man. But when she came out of it, she said, if you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. But if you look at Christ, you'll be at rest. So particularly in this time of health and economic crisis, are we looking at the world and experiencing distress? Or are we looking within and experiencing anxiety or fear or loneliness or depression? Or are we looking at Christ and knowing the rest, knowing his rest, as we run with perseverance the race set out before us? So in this next week and in the uncertainty of the weeks ahead, Let us keep our eyes fixed firmly on Jesus. Amen.